Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says he's waiting for a strong demonstration by the US of sanctions pressure on Russia. Zelenskyy was speaking in Kyiv after leading Russian figures said Moscow could not accept US proposals for a ceasefire in their current form. The US President, Donald Trump, is pushing Kyiv and Moscow to agree on a halt to the fighting. Zelenskyy says he is prepared to accept an unconditional ceasefire. The Ukrainian president was speaking during a meeting with the German Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock. She visited Kyiv on Tuesday for talks with Ukrainian leaders. The German Foreign Minister said the US should not be misled by any of what she called Russian President Vladimir Putin's stalling tactics.
Putin is playing for time. He is trying to wriggle out of negotiations, continuing his war of aggression in violation of international law and escalating it with brutal, threatening attacks on homes. Putin cannot be trusted in this situation. There will only be real and lasting peace when the Russian president realizes that he cannot win this war, that his destruction is not successful.
Angela Stent is a senior non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for joining us on the show, Angela. The German foreign minister saying the US should not be misled by what she called Russian stalling tactics. Is she right? And will anyone in the White House be listening to her?
Well, I think she's certainly right. I mean, it's been clear from the beginning of these negotiations that Putin isn't interested in ending the war because he thinks Russia is winning. What he's interested in is the restoration of US-Russian relations and the lifting of sanctions. And so he has been, I mean, from the beginning, the Russians have been stalling. You know, they agreed to a limited ceasefire on energy and infrastructure, but that hasn't happened. And so I think the question is, at what point will the Trump administration realize that Putin isn't serious about any of this and then take some action to put pressure on him? Because so far they've done nothing to pressure Russia.
What do you make of the reported statement by Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Rybkov, that US proposals are unacceptable in their current form? And what does he mean by saying that the root causes of the conflict haven't been addressed yet?
So, I mean, Vladimir Putin himself has been saying this for some time, although he hasn't said it for the past couple of weeks since the negotiations first began. What the Russians mean by that is that the Ukrainians have to accept all of their conditions, which is the recognition of the annexation of the 4 territories that Russia partially occupies in Ukraine, of the long-term annexation of Crimea, that they want to get rid of Zelenskyy. Putin has said he's not a legitimate leader, and that the ultimate cause, they claim, is NATO, and therefore Ukraine would have to agree never to join NATO, but also NATO would have to agree to withdraw troops from some of the new members of NATO where it has troops. So what the Russians are saying is that they won't start proper negotiations until all of their conditions are met. And that could be an initial bargaining tool for them, but they're going to have to make some compromises if the war is to come to an end.
Angela, you mentioned more pressure on Russia. I mean, is the Kremlin at all worried by Trump's latest threats of increased sanctions? I mean, is there any suggestion that that could force Putin to negotiate more seriously?
Well, they don't seem to be worried up till now. I think the White House would have to actually start imposing those sanctions to let the Russians know that they have the legislation or the executive orders ready to do it, because so far these are just words. And again, the Trump administration has done nothing to impose any costs on Russia, while it's put an enormous amount of pressure on Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Donald Trump is saying that he expects to talk to Vladimir Putin later this week. What do you think that conversation could potentially achieve?
Well, I mean, I'm sure that he will try and persuade Putin at least to go along with the temporary ceasefire. Whether he will actually threaten to impose sanctions remains to be seen. We don't know what happens in a private conversation, but publicly, he's really never criticized anything that Russia has done.
If we could talk about the rare earth deal for a moment that with Ukraine that Donald Trump tried to make happen. We heard Germany's foreign minister saying today that any deal with the US has to comply with European law. And the Ukrainian foreign minister is saying a deal cannot contradict his country's path to EU membership. So where does all of that leave Donald Trump's deal making?
So the Americans have come back now with a much larger and more extensive minerals deal where they really would control a large amount of Ukraine's natural resources and even possibly the major nuclear power plant, the Zaporizhzhia power plant that's currently actually occupied by Russia. So this is much more apparently, again, we haven't publicly seen the deal, than they had suggested in the beginning. And I think it would be, as far as one understands, incompatible with aspects of EU law. On the other hand, as we know, the Trump administration does not exactly have a high regard for the European Union. So Zelenskyy himself has said that the deal as it now stands, that he wouldn't be able to sign it precisely because it might mean that Ukraine could never join the European Union. So that, I think, is a stalemate at the moment.
Mm-hmm. What leverage does the US have over Russia and Ukraine to push for this ceasefire, to make something happen?
Well, the leverage it has over Ukraine, we already saw it used a few weeks ago when the U.S. cut off intelligence and satellite information support for Ukraine, and the situation got much worse on the battlefield there. So they have plenty of leverage against Ukraine. They can say there'll be no more support there. They do have leverage over Russia, but that would involve much more robust sanctions, secondary sanctions, sanctioning people and entities who are involved in averting the current sanctions on oil exports and things like that. They could send many more arms to Ukraine, which would also put more pressure on the Russian army. So that they do have levers against Russia, but again, they have to be willing to use them.
And just briefly, how crucial is Europe's continued military and, of course, financial support for Ukraine?
Oh, it's crucial. I mean, it's indispensable because it's clear that whatever happens, the U.S. is not going to continue giving Ukraine the kind of assistance that it did during the Biden administration. And Europe is obviously trying to step up, but it doesn't quite have the wherewithal at the moment to replace everything that the U.S. has done. But I think without European support, it will be much more difficult for Ukraine to continue to fight this war, which Vladimir Putin seems in no hurry to end.
Angela Stent from the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. Angela, thank you so much for your time.